everyone. Today we are joined by Sarah, who has worked remotely in over 12 countries over the last 12 months while researching and living the future of work. Based on her extensive knowledge and research, Sarah wrote and published the number one bestseller around remote work, Remotivation, the remote worker's ultimate guide to life changing fulfillment. She supports organizations remotivate their employees in a hybrid workforce and regularly speaks on employee motivation, engagement, and performance. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Sarah, you have the set of four questions that all remote employees should ask their future managers, their future companies. I want to get a bit into these and talk about the importance of these questions and why the remote workers should delve into this. But a bit on the other side, the perspective from employers. I believe your first question is how is performance managed and evaluated in your company? Something that all remote workers, myself included, should be very knowledgeable before joining a new company. But why is this important to get it right for employers? How can they get this right, and how can they enable remote workers with performance management and evaluation?
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why I recommend the employee to ask that question is to ensure that they're going to be set up for success when they start working in an organization, that there's clear performance management. From the employer side, it's important if you're managing a virtual or a hybrid team that regardless of where those employees are located, that each of them have very clear, defined, and aligned goals for themselves, business objectives, KPIs, whatever you call them in your organization. I said earlier that hybrid teams are one of the hardest types of teams to manage. And often because what creeps in is something called proximity bias, which I'm sure we'll talk to a bit later. But this idea that the people, the employees that are in close physical proximity to their manager, they get more opportunities, they get to lead more initiatives, they're assumed to be working harder or performing better. So it's really important that you're not forgetting about your team members that might be working remotely, whether by choice or by nature of their role, and that regardless of where they're located, all of them have very clear objectives and performance goals so that there's equity in the way that you're evaluating how they're doing. So that you're not assuming that the people that are in the office or that you see physically more often are the ones that are working harder. And so if I were a candidate interviewing for a job, I would want to make sure that that hiring manager was able to articulate the performance management process of the organization. And if they were able to tell me, here's how we do it quarterly, we do it annually, whatever the process is, we base it on X amount of objectives or KPIs plus leadership traits or behaviors that are important for the organization, I would be impressed as an employee. I would feel comfortable that my performance would be measured equitably amongst anyone else in the organization. And if the manager was sort of hesitant or didn't know, or is like, well, ask HR because I'm not really sure, that would be a bit of a red flag for me as a candidate because it would tell me, like, I don't know if I'm going to be set up for success in that company because my performance might not be evaluated in the same way as someone else. So that would be my recommendation for all managers to really ensure that you're clear and aware of what your performance management processes are if an potential job candidate asks you that question in an interview.
Nice, nice. It's one of those subjects that it's very hard to get it right, and I think you touched on a very critical point with the proximity bias, and I think that's what we have been seeing in the hybrid world or our concerns.
Right.
I think stem a lot from that. And we have seen many mandates of return to office or harder
Mhm.
hybrid, more in office than really remote and dynamic. And a lot of these folks mention that creativity is being impacted. And I think you touch also this on
Mhm.
what you published. And how can we look into the creativity side of things? How can an employer give reassurance to a new joiner, a new candidate, that creativity is being really encouraged and recognized in the organization.
Right. Yes, I think that as a manager, being able to clearly share how your organization encourages creativity, how they document uh, ideas, how they brainstorm together in a way that is remote first, regardless, again, if it's a hybrid or fully remote policy, is really important, especially with so many companies having hybrid teams. Again, you want to make sure you're being inclusive of everyone's ideas, regardless of where they're located, to make sure you're coming up with the most innovative and creative solutions possible. So, as an employer, as a manager, again, if I was interviewing a candidate, I would want to be able to share all the technology or tools or processes we use to encourage and create new ideas in the organization and generate new ideas in the organization. I think it's a red flag if the manager says, well, it's important that people come into the office in order for us to really, be in the same room and brainstorm and whiteboard activities. Like that's how creativity comes to the surface. And that's, what that's our primary objectives, to make sure that, people are coming into the office, and because we can't, figure out other ways to be creative, like that would be a red flag for me, because certainly with people's different communication styles and ways of working, that's not always the number one way to generate creativity. And just by nature of the word creative, right? If someone's saying we're only creative in this specific way, that means they themselves are not being creative, right? So it's like, what are all the ways and ideas and forms that we can generate new ideas in this company? So as a manager, you should be equipped to talk about the different ways your company supports creativity in the organization.
A bit outside of your key questions, which have obviously is a focus of our conversation today, but do you think that companies need to work synchronously for that creativity, or that we can stem asynchronous creativity throughout? We mentioned tooling, etc. So it's another challenge that I
Yeah.
always see with companies. Oh, we need to all be synchronous so that we can have that burstiness of creativity.
Yeah, I think a combination is great. And a lot of people work even better asynchronously sometimes, because they might not be the type of person who's going to talk over you or jump in an idea, or interrupt you in a meeting, because that's not their style, or they're someone that needs to reflect more and consider and build on top of existing ideas once they've had time to think on their own, or maybe do a little research or investigate. So it is great to have that combination. So even if there was an in-person brainstorm, documenting all those things, giving people time to reflect, look back at it, add ideas, or maybe there's a tool you use, or even just a simple shared, Google Doc, where people on their own time, when they are um, some people are thinking really clearly and effectively, they're in the morning. Some people it's in the evening. You want to account for the different ways people work too. So asynchronous communication really allows for that. So having a shared document where people can add ideas when they're at their best, when they're thinking clearly, when they're not as distracted, is a great way to source ideas. Again, being in person too, I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but it's important to consider both, because people do have different styles and ways of working.
Yeah, I think it turns us into much more equitable workforce when each one can bring their best in the ways they work best. But I also agree with you. I think being in person can really. I think there's still that connection that can be quite rich in terms of the human side of things. Um,
Definitely.
you raise another one, which I think is the broadest question of all, which is what defines the culture of an organization. I think this, for any company, they could go for hours and hours talking about this.
Right.
But how do you think an employer can really nail this question? Because it's so hard. Like you can go on a tangent very easily. It can be hard to nail it. How do you think they can really demonstrate to the candidate or to the employee that this is
Right.
our culture, this is how we work, and this is our expectations?
Yeah. I love this one, because I think for a lot of people, their mind goes directly to what's fun about your company, and the ping pong table in the break room and the pizza parties and the happy hours, those are fun, right? And those create bonding, but I don't believe that that's necessarily culture. So for me, a company's culture is a set of values to which everyone operates and behaves against. And it's the values against which people are hired, people are promoted, people are developed, and people are let go because they're not, living the values of the organization. So they're not just a list of great sounding words that you put on the conference room wall or you put on a mug and you give to everyone on day one, but you never talk about again. So you can say, oh yeah, we have values, but if it's not integrated into the culture, and the decisions that are made and your operating principles, it's not going to create a culture, right? It's just a list. So for me, that's what culture really means. As a manager, interviewing someone that might join my company, or wanting to motivate my team and create a way that we can all rally around, like values for which we could all rally around, I would make sure to really integrate it into everything we do. So again, like the interview questions you ask that are related to the values of the organization when you're considering hiring a candidate, when you're doing your company's talent development process. So it's not just about, has this employee hit all their KPIs and deliverables, but how did they go about it? Did they step over everyone to get ahead? Or did they live the values that are part of what makes the culture of your organization? And so in all those decisions, it's important to incorporate that. And I think that's what really makes the culture of a company.
Yeah, I personally focus a lot, especially when hiring, on values alignment. I think we are in a very multicultural world, which sometimes is very hard to nail what exactly is. And I think there is so much richness about the different cultures and the way people operate. But
Right.
that I agree with you. Like having that value alignment, I think it's critical. Though no one
Yeah.
trying to overstep on anyone. That's how I tend to focus on hiring and really perceiving the values of remote, which are public. So it makes my job easier when everything is shared openly. Um, you touched before on the proximity bias, and it resonates with me because I'm completely remote. I work very distant from my peers and my managers, but that's not the case in most of the scenarios. I think the world is around 30% remote, but the other 70% are still very much in office or hybrid. And how can companies address this potential proximity bias? And some examples that you have seen of best practice, like this company, I don't need names, but these folks really nailed it, or this should be the way that your company should go, so that we can also help our audience into really going in the right direction. Because hybrid is a reality, good or bad, either we love it or not, it's a reality, and trying
Yeah.
to help that audience would be amazing from your experience.
Yeah. So best practices I've seen around addressing proximity bias are admitting that all of us might have that, whether we want to admit that or not. None of us like to say we have any type of bias, right? Whatever the case may be. But it is quite natural that the people you see in front of you on a day-to-day basis, that might be, the people that are coming into the office more regularly if you're in a hybrid setup, they're the people you might connect with more, network more. As a manager, when you hear about a potential project, because you physically see a specific person in the office, you might think of them first to give them an opportunity. So I think it's admitting that it is natural and it happens, yet becoming conscious that that could be a bias you have, and putting in some plans or steps to mitigate that bias. So what I've seen companies do is really say, like, hey, like, let's admit this might be something a lot of us have. It is natural, and we want to make sure that we think about how to mitigate that in this new world of work where not everyone's in the office, and where spending 8 hours sitting at your desk does not necessarily mean you're working harder or smarter, right? That person might be on social media half the day, even though they're sitting at their desk, where the person at home might be cranking away. We don't know. And I think what we've learned too over the last few years is that what's more important is the quality of the deliverables, right? Not the specific hours someone works or where they're doing their work from. And we don't want to forget those lessons we learned during the pandemic when everyone was forced to be remote, right? And we saw a lot of productivity. So first steps, so I've seen successful companies do just admitting like this is a thing that exists and we might have it, but let's figure out how to mitigate it. So then how do we mitigate it? So then as a manager, I would want to make sure like, okay, what am I doing to ensure everyone's voices are included? Everyone gets equal opportunity at a new, like leading a new project or initiative when that should come along, that I'm inclusive of everyone's ideas, no matter where they're located. And so those are some things. And then you figure out, okay, what parts of the process of things we do already can I make sure, like in my one-on-ones with that person, how do I make sure I know what they're working on, I know what they want to do more of, that I'm considering them for activities when we're on a Zoom call. Some people might be in the room physically with you, some people might be on the phone, that you're not just talking to the people in the room, that you're being inclusive of who's ever on the phone, that you're asking directly, hey Pedro, what do you think about this? So you're being inclusive of those ideas. So just putting in little reminders for yourself as a manager, to ensure that that natural bias doesn't come out, that you're trying to mitigate it as much as possible, through those meetings, through more inclusive conversations. And I think once you have an awareness about something, it's easier to do something about it. So just talking about proximity bias, saying this is a thing and a lot of us might have it, and what can we do to mitigate it, I think is probably the most powerful first step.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you very much for sharing with us, turning a bit remotivation upside down and focusing on employers' advice, which can be critical for the success of an organization and the success of each individual in our organizations. Thank you very much for your input. I think it was super valuable for our audience. And I think you've written it, so it's for us to really go deeper on your book and really try to get the best out of it. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.